The story of the immortal army and a military division known as SS Галичина. Some consider them heroes and patriots, while others traitors and military criminals. We're going to try to understand this complex issue together with Doctor of Philology, Ірина Фаріон. Miss Iryna, welcome to our show. So, the Galicia Division is also the 4th Grenadier Division, SS Galicia, a military subunit of Waffen SS German troops, which existed between 1943 and 1945, and was staffed mainly by Ukrainians of Greek Catholic creed, actually compromised exclusively of Galicians. In April 19, 1945, the recompleted unit received a new status and a new name, the 1st Ukrainian Division, an independent Ukrainian army. What do we know about this formation today?
The first mistake that society makes is it evaluates historical events from the point of view of present circumstances. The second mistake is that the absolute majority of society lives with stereotypes and has no strength in itself to break those stereotypes. The third mistake is not reading materials of diverse perspectives, but scooping up information from a single source. Together, all these three views give us a false assessment of those historical events. So let's try to find out what is Galicia Division, and we will understand it only in case if we discover for ourselves the preconditions for the creation of such a formation. You are right to note that the formation was created in April of 1943. On April 28th, it was announced solemnly. In view, the Day of Embroidery is celebrated since and now associated with the creation of Division Galicia. The best of the nation's youth enlisted into the Galicia Division. The young Ukrainian generation, students were signing up in entire groups. In fact, the entire theatrical company of Lviv Opera House signed up as well.
Why was it so popular? What was its essence and purpose?
I will explain about its essence and purpose. So the year was 1939. In 1939, the Red Army comes onto the territory of Western Ukraine. What did this bring to the Galicians? In 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. In accordance with the pact, Europe was redistributed. This has brought to the Ukrainians 300,000 deported to Siberia at once. 300,000, imagine? 300,000 deported to Siberia, and an absolute overflow of prisons in Galicia, expanding into Volyn region filled with Ukrainians. In particular, the Lansky prison in Lviv. How did we find out? We learned that when in 1941 the Germans came to Galicia and opened prisons. In those prisons we saw a huge number of people's corpses. At least 30,000 people have been killed in Western Ukraine. What does this mean for the inhabitants of Western Ukraine? It meant they had to search for an immediate ally in the war with the Red Army. For what the Red Army was, we have already seen. In the end, we saw it not only in 1939. We have seen this once before in 1914, when there was the First World War, and Moscow troops came. They sent the Metropolitan Sheptytsky to exile right away, closed all Ukrainian schools, destroyed the Enlightenment society called Prosvita. So began the collapse of Russification in Galicia, which, by the way, is on the rise again very seriously.
So at the time, Germany could be the only ally? Was it the right choice?
That ally was very situational and very relative. The task was different. Each war is always interpreted as a way to assert your state. Remember the First World War? How did Ukrainians interpret the First World War? They had to create their own armed forces. When this armed formation arose, it was called the Sitch Arrows, Sitchovy Strelci. Then this armed formation of the Sitch riflemen transformed into the Ukrainian Galician army. Here history was repeated as history repeats itself in less than 20 years. And here among intellectuals, I emphasize in the intellectual environment, in particular in the area of the nationalist democratic influence, which was then headed by Kubiovich. Kubiovich was a very well-known intellectual who became the author of the Encyclopedia of Ukrainian Studies project, which was prohibited in Soviet times. And for us, the Soviet generation who called Sovok or a dust coup, the Encyclopedia of Ukrainian Studies was the main source in the early 90s about the true history of Ukraine, culture, and so on. And this Kubiovich, immediately after the war, turns to the German circles with the proposal so that Ukrainians get the opportunity to form their military structures as part of the German army. What was the motivation? It was very simple. What if the Germans take over Western Ukraine? They will sooner or later start to mobilize Ukrainians to their army. What does this mean? This meant that the Ukrainians in this German army will eventually assimilate, would then simply dissolve. So it was necessary to outstrip the step of the Germans by mobilizing Ukrainians to the army. Because if they were not mobilized by Germans, then the Red Army would come and mobilize Ukrainians instead. So it was necessary to take the step to beat the Germans to it so that Ukrainians could not be taken into the German army one by one or be exported as Ostarbeiters, as my father was, for example. It was during this period that my father was taken away to Germany, and he endured it immensely. And when in 1945 the Germans offered my father to stay, my dad answered the Germans, "Did I come here on my own? I did not come here to you. You brought me here by force. I have my own motherland."
Okay, Ms. Iryna, but in order for Ukrainians not to dissolve in this German army, were there specific requests for Germans?
Of course, absolutely.
In order for it to be a pro-Ukrainian identity military structure?
Of course, and this idea arose, the idea of Kubiovich together with Vektor, I hope I got his name right, Otto Vektor, who then was the head of Галичина district. He was the son of an Austrian general and had a favorable attitude towards Ukrainians. To be honest, no nation was purely altruistic in its attentions towards Ukrainians. Let's be honest, each foreigner always only pursued his own interests. So if Ukrainians were going to take the step in creating their own military formation, in which they would receive professional training, where would they get such training otherwise? Where? In the woods? In the woods they would not receive a professional training. Their training there would be primarily received at the cost of their own lives. And so this Otto Vektor, who was the son of an Austrian general, who remembered Ukrainians since the times of the Sitch riflemen and the UGA, picked up this idea, and this idea really suited the policy of Eastern Germany. Not from the side of Hitler. Hitler did not know at all about the formation of the Galicia division. Hitler learned about it in March of 1945, on March 23rd, and ordered an immediate disband of this division. Because eventually these men would turn their weapons against the Germans, and he thought right. But then there would be no one to defend the front, and this division had not been disbanded. Before the division was formed, several requests were put forward. The main request was that the Ukrainian division should have its own clergy. Their own chaplains, yes, your own clergy. Further, the Ukrainian division in no case should fight on any other front than the Eastern Front, and do not have to fight against the Allies, that is, against France and against England. Once Ukrainians were thrown against the French, what did Ukrainians do? They went straight to the French side. And one more condition, it should be Ukrainian in essence. Ukrainians should have their own honors, not German honors. This lightning bolt associated with the Latin god, the familiar silver lightning bolt on a black background. Germans did not allow Ukrainians to use their own emblems, the trident for example, but they allowed them to use the symbol of the lion, a yellow lion on a blue background, or a silver lion on a black background. In addition, originally Germans did not allow for this division to be called Ukrainian. It was their condition not to allow even the slightest separatist ideas. But they agreed to give awards eventually. They were honors, really. Or as they would be right to call symbols. They agreed on these symbols, with the exception of the trident, not to call this division Ukrainian. As you mentioned, that the name has evolved, then as the Germans lost, they immediately retreated and then gave us all of the identifying Ukrainian signs, and the division eventually began to be called Ukrainian. In the end, the division had to develop into the Ukrainian National Army, which was headed by General Shandruk. But this happened later. Did the Germans fulfill these conditions? The division fought in the territory of Galicia, the Battle of Brody in particular. The division stopped the entrance of the Red Army to Lviv, at least for 10 days. During those 10 days, when the division fought the Red Army like a beast, and the Germans fell down and retreated immediately, and the division was the second in formation. Within those 10 days, the intelligentsia of Lviv could leave the city. Then this Lviv intelligentsia accused those young men who died for them, those 8,000 men who died, 70% of the division. They accused them of collaboration and betrayal. And the rest of such slander.
You actually mentioned the defeat of the division near the city of Brody. So was there really a defeat or not?
What is very important for us to realize, these young men who were mobilized to the division, the demand was crazy because there were only 3 options for them. One option was to join the division and receive training in the German army. Then it was believed that this was the best training. And really, as the historians say, I hope the adequate ones, that there were at least 200 Ukrainian men who received an officer's title. No other divisions, whether it's the Lithuanians or the Latvians, whether they were representatives of Asian countries, did not receive a higher military rank. As a result of this training in the German army, except for Ukrainians, here Germans really allowed Ukrainians in to obtain a professional military training. People would remember that there was no such UPA, Ukrainian Insurgent Army unit, in which there wouldn't be a trained division member. Because the Galicia division worked so closely with the Ukrainian Insurgent Army UPA, we will say more about it in a moment. So part of the youth was mostly intelligentsia, who went to the Galicia division with the primary goal to get an excellent training, and the second to turn weapons against the Bolsheviks. This was the main condition which was presented by the Galicia division. We are fighting a specific enemy. This one enemy is Red Moscow. We're not fighting anyone else, period. If we find ourselves in a different territory, then we are on the side of those against whom you are forcing us to fight, force us to turn weapons. So the other way, yes, to go where? Into the woods. At this time, when the Galicia division was formed in Lviv, in Frankivsk, then called Stanislav, and in Ternopil in western Ukraine. The Ukrainian insurgent army did not have such a widespread publicity, because it was formed where? Not in Galicia, it was formed in Volhynia. By the way, only later on the Galicia division joined the Volhynia regiment. Therefore, in principle, Galicians had no other choice in order to fight Red Moscow than to enroll in Galicia division. In addition, there were social benefits. Families whose children went to the Galicia division were on the list of those who had to be taken care of. A so-called council was created, who looked after the families of those who sent their children to protect their homeland. That is, some elemental social security package, because those men who went into the woods did not have anything. You understand? The most interesting thing is that a cooperation began between the Galicia division and the UPA, and it is very important for us to say that the organization of the Ukrainian nationalists of the OUN Banderivci was officially against enlisting in the Galicia division. And you know why? What Stepan Bandera would say? How strategically this man envisioned things. Later there would be a war in the information field. Subsequently, 50 or 60 years later, Russia will start a war against Ukrainians via the media. And they will call Ukrainians collaborators, because they collaborated with the Germans. Can you imagine how perceptive Stepan Bandera was to predict it? But OUN knew this from the very beginning, the emergence of this struggle. Although members of OUN were aware that some of their men would enlist in the Galicia division, it was almost impossible to stop them. So then Roman Shukhevych, one of the commanders of Nachtgal battalion in October 1943, meets one of the representatives of the division headquarters. And they discussed cooperation. That is, division members would help the Ukrainian insurgent army UPA. With what? Weapons first and foremost.
Were they essentially using Germans to get weapons?
So, with that they have received impeccable security. And I would like to emphasize, they have never been, how our current non-historians whistle cannon fodder. They have really been practicing the whole year. Cannon fodder was in the Red Army. Only after a year of training, they were put to the battle in the so-called Brody wedge. But I want to finish this topic about cooperation of the Galicia division with the UPA. Roman Shukhevych leading this conversation with a representative, let's say the division headquarters, asking that those deeply infiltrated members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, would join the Galicia division. With what purpose? To learn how to fight. The Germans absolutely did not want to accept this, because the Ukrainian insurgent army, UPA, fiercely fought the Germans in guerrilla warfare. That is, the Germans taught Ukrainians through the UPA to fight with themselves. The Germans realized it.
So they didn't want this cooperation between the SS Division Galicia and UPA?
Of course, the Germans tried to block this cooperation, but their efforts were in vain, because it is said that at least 2,000 men, after the defeat of the German 14 or 13 corps, some say it was the 13th, others the 14th. Let them clear the facts. The Germans were mercilessly defeated. More than 2,000 men quit the division of Brody to immediately join the Ukrainian insurgent army, and this flow of men from the division to the Ukrainian insurgent army continued to happen. And it was a colossal exchange of experience. And the most educated people in the UPA, as we learned later, these were just these division members who learned to fight from Germans against Germans as well as against Muscovites. Simply become a military, the first military aristocracy in Ukraine. This is what Ukrainian society should know. And Ukrainian society must realize that if one didn't go to the Galicia division and wanted to defend his land, because he's a Ukrainian, then that guy would have to go to the Ukrainian insurgent army, or he would be forcibly taken to the Red Army, or he would be taken as an Ostarbeiter to Germany. Out of those four options, and only those options, it was the ultimate choice to assert themselves as a Ukrainian, and we must give them their right in history and stop judging them today and acknowledge those people as heroes because they really were heroes.
Do we have the names of these heroes today?
Of course we have the names of those heroes. And the diaspora itself, when they would, General Shandruk, who was supposed to organize the flow of the Galicia division into the Ukrainian National Army a few days before the defeat of Germany, went on to communicate with the English so that the Galicia division surrendered to the British as captives. He drove the army from the front lines and moved the Ukrainian division to the area under British control. Therefore, most of the divisions were located in England and Italy, mostly in the city of Rimini. Each division member went through a commission, examining them on a subject of committing crimes against humanity. I want to emphasize that the divisionists were not a formation of the SS Guard. That's why they did not execute Jews. They fought only on the front, and according to Descher's commission, if I correctly remember the last name, Check me on this one. According to this commission, which made its conclusion in Canada in the year 1987, not one member of the division was accused in crimes against humanity and military or war crimes.
Was this a political stunt?
Of course, the Nuremberg trial didn't have one negative thing to say about the division members. The division members, as they emphasized it at every step, never shared the ideology of Nazism. Fascism existed in Italy. It was a nationalist outlook. None of them were members of the Nazi party. These were the people who used the German army in its own battle for a state that did not exist. Can you imagine the level of their heroism? With no existing state, they fought the enemy. They understood that it was an enemy. We have memoirs of the uneasy relationship that was between the division members and the head of the division, by the name Freitag, Fritz Freitag, who during the Battle of Brody simply abandoned his army. He fled and then returned like nothing happened. Well, for a happy ending, he committed suicide. He could not withstand the defeat of Germany in the war. But this person did not treat Ukrainians too well and clashed with them on every level. And these conflicts were described by the Chief of Staff with the surname Heike. And so the Chief of Staff, this Captain Heike, his memoirs are published in Ukrainian, with incredibly interesting analytics, as well as psychological characteristics of Ukrainian soldiers. And this endeavor, as Heike writes, of Ukrainians to remain themselves amidst a foreign army, Ukrainians really managed to do it. It's an army of heroes. Take a look, for example, when they entered the American zone and the English zone, there in the West. They became the promoters of the Ukrainian idea. Among them was an outstanding Ukrainian linguist, Oleksy Gorbach, who fought in the Galicia division. Among them were poets, writers, patrons.
Did some of them return to Ukraine? Was it possible at the moment?
Part of them did return. They say that it is close to 1,000 people. Again, the Repatriation Commission arrived in Rimini from the Soviet Union after the end of the war and began to work with our soldiers. By the way, after this defeat near the city of Brody, the Galicia division resumed its original count in a week. Such overwhelming was the demand because these men understood that the Germans are losing. Why do we have to go to war? In order to learn how to fight. Because the state without military professionals is not a state. We feel it today. And then Galicia division would be replenished with Ukrainians from the greater eastern Ukraine, not only from western Ukraine. As I was saying, the Repatriation Commission tricked them. More than 1,000 people listened to them and returned. Here I repeat what was previously mentioned.
What awaited them? Yes, the writer Iván Багряний in 1945, he wrote a great novel called The Fiery Circle, precisely about them.
The heroes of Galicia division, what awaited them? The so-called filtration camps. In those camps, they still had to check everyone. The check ended, with all of them being sent to Siberia. So, of course, it ended with Siberia.
Did they understand that in case they would return to the Soviet Union, they wouldn't be called heroes there?
Yes, but their relatives were there. Their mother and father were here, and probably their sweetheart as well. Their children were here. They themselves were the children of the generation of those who fought for the Ukrainian state between 1917 and 1921. How did my father return? My father returned in 1945 from Germany. If he didn't return, I wouldn't have been born. But my dad lived in fear that it would be discovered, and he went out in the open after 40 years, and into his bank account, $400 were deposited. That is, the Germans paid every Ostarbeiter for the fact that he worked for Germany. And I remember that then. I bought my first computer, and I asked my father, why haven't you ever told me about this? My father lowered his eyes and said, I was afraid. I'm amazed at how I survived. But how did my dad pay for it? Paying for the fact that nobody gave him an education, he had no right to apply anywhere. So my father's main dream was the education of his children, for Ihor, my brother, and I to receive an education. The fact that Farion is a professor is a merit of my dad. It was a goal I set before myself because my father could not realize it himself. As one who worked in Germany, you know. But I want to name one more episode. Remember the fallen Maidan protesters from 2014? Volodymyr Boykiv? So his own father, Vasil Boykiv, fought in the Galicia division. And during the Brody operation, he was terribly wounded. And when he was taken to the medic's tent, he found himself under terrible gunfire, and he already completely shell-shocked, opened his eyes and saw Red Army soldiers standing over him.
When he was wounded in Brody.
Right. These red soldiers stand before him speaking Ukrainian, saying, "Here's the fascist, look at the fascist." And Mr. Boykiv hears the word fascist, pronounced in the Eastern Ukrainian dialect, whereas in Western Ukraine it was pronounced differently. "Let's shoot him," they shout. And then he says, "I gathered the last ounce of strength to whisper, 'I am Ukrainian.' 'Ah, this one is ours,' they replied in Ukrainian. That is the power of language. This Vasil Boykiv is of course sent to the Red Army. What is his destiny? Filter in camps, Siberia. Then he returns. He manages to receive an education. This is very interesting. He graduates from Lviv Polytechnic, builds our bus terminal in Lviv, built one of our main churches, Princess Olga and Volodymyr the Great. And his son Volodymyr Boykiv dies on February 18th at the barricades. Here is the continuity of generations. Everyone found a way to take up arms, like a true man would, to fight for their independence.
If we already mentioned that the SS Division Galicia fought, or so to speak cooperated with the Ukrainian insurgent army, then in contrast to Vlasov's army, what is the difference in what?
Sure, look.
After all, everyone was looking for their own way to defend the interests of Ukrainian side. The state wasn't there yet, but still, it was a Ukrainian nation.
Well, to be more precise, such legions, actually relatively as part of the German army, were created in every nation. The Baltic peoples, even Englishmen, and the French had their own divisions. And Vlasov's army of 1,000,000, as it was called there, Roa, seems to be the Russian Liberation Army. So, this Roa, what were the Germans bent on? You know what they were interested in? The Germans were inclined so that the Roa and the Ukrainian National Army, led by General Shandruk, would come to terms with each other and have single leadership, to which the Ukrainian National Army, under the leadership of Shandruk, which was not realized as a project, of course, refused. That is, the Germans pursued a completely different goal than, say, Ukrainians. Ukrainians understood that this is an enemy, and this has once again confirmed that Ukrainians fought with Russians of various agendas.
So Vlasov's army was also our enemy.
Of course, no collaboration with them was possible. That was their choice. Let Russian historians and Russian society evaluate them. I have no interest in them. I only think of our own heroes, those holy people who are in the diaspora, for the idea of the liberation of the Ukrainian state did more than all governments of Ukraine here in Ukraine. And still, do you understand? For propaganda of the Ukrainian national idea, they published journals there. They worked in respectable educational institutions. They created fraternities. They sent money to Ukraine. These are the people who left then with an idea of an independent Ukraine. They must be honored at the level of the heroes of the Ukrainian insurgent army and at the level of other formations in the struggle for national liberation. This is an absolute injustice towards those people who chose this way in the struggle for the Ukrainian state.
And we're aware of the propaganda, of course. And for the SS Division Galicia, for a long time they were called traitors and criminals. So when did historical justice begin to be restored?
Historical justice began to recover in the early 90s, and it surfaced in a very interesting popular form. When in Lviv, cars were noticed with the emblem of the golden lion on a blue background. We then did not even understand what that meant. For us, it was something surprising. Those war honors of the soldiers of the SS Galicia division, and so slowly it began to be popular in society. But in society, Stepan Bandera's prediction came true, that within 60 years a war will be waged against you on the information field. Terrible information warfare. Stepan Bandera, this very far-sighted man, and therefore he publicly resented such cooperation of Ukrainians with the German army. As we see, Stepan Bandera was right. But we will be more so justified when we contradict the lies brought against us. We respect all those people who, in extremely difficult circumstances, took arms in hand and fought. And they fought like lions desperately. By the way, 2 members of the division were awarded the highest honors. One of the most active members of the November Order, Dmytro Pali, died on the battlefield near Brody.
Активніших учасників листопадового чину Дмитро Паліїв загинув саме на полі битву під Бродами. Але Бродівський
But that battle in Brody gave Lviv's intelligentsia the opportunity to leave Ukraine and survive.
What conclusions do we have to make today? After all, some historians say that the heroes of SS Galicia Division, like the heroes of UPA, don't need any further acknowledgement. What do you think?
God have mercy, these historians are juvenile, who now hold high positions even though they are not one bit worthy of this generation of heroes, which lived so many years ago. Do not listen to just one author. Surround yourself with stacks of literature. Even better, you know what you should do? Read the memoirs of the division, the voices of the now deceased. An 800-page book was published in Lviv by the Galician Division Brotherhood. Author Igor Ivankov in 2016. When you start reading the memoirs of these division members, it will give you the best estimate of their activities, not an interpretation of the contemporary amateur historians or those who live by the stereotypes of the Soviet era.
By the way, we remembered Bagrianyj. He also had a piece about the divisions.
Yes, Bagrianyj witnessed the formation of Galicia Division and the Ukrainian insurgent army. And he wrote a piece that you already mentioned in the previous program called Lyuba, which he destroyed. It was about the Ukrainian insurgent army. Fortunately, the one about Galician Division, the Fiery Circle, was published.
Anyone can read it.
Today, we have the widest possible opportunity to find out for ourselves about the extremely difficult circumstances in which these holy people lived.
Today we spoke about the Army of Immortals with Ірина Фаріон. I thank you for an interesting exchange and thanks to the viewers who took the time to join us.